Yes. Let's see. Why don't you take it away?
All right. So hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm going to be talking today about the Sierra Nevada tree mortality patterns and recovery, and specifically how that relates to some of our common forest management practices. I'm Amarina Wuenschel. I work for the Forest Service. I'm an ecologist zone for the Sierra, the Sequoia, and the Inyo National Forest. I'm going to be talking about work that I did with Derek Young. He was the main analyzer of the data I'm going to be talking about. Becky Estes, Sheena Gross, Mark Meyer, and Hugh Safford. We are all with the Region 5 Ecology Program with the Forest Service. We were responsible for designing the project and performing the study. And Christina Rustano headed up the writing of one of the papers I'm going to be talking about in the first part of my presentation today. And Derek Young and Christina Rustano, I should say, are well, they both were with the University of California, Davis at the start of this work, and now Christina Rustano is with the University of Nevada, Reno. Can everybody hear me, or can you hear me okay, Alexis? All right, great. And also, I should apologize if I'm awkwardly looking off to the side. It's because the slideshow presentation is showing up on my other monitor here. So I'm going to set the stage and say, and I think this will probably come to no surprise as any of you, that a lot of trees died during the Sierra Nevada mortality event. But just to really set the background in case some of you are less familiar with these systems, I'm going to repeat this statistic that I've heard so many times now, and that's that there was a severe hot drought in California between 2012 and 2016, which resulted in the death of an estimated 29 million trees. So that's a lot of trees. And really, I get asked this all the time, so I'll just explain it for your sake. It was really a combination of water stress, the trees didn't have enough water, and insect attack. So what typically would happen would be that the trees didn't have enough resources anymore to defend themselves from insect attack in the way that they normally would in a normal water year. For instance, they couldn't pitch out beetles. And then, beetles suddenly had all these food sources and their populations were able to explode. And so they could mass attack even healthy trees. So, and by healthy trees, I mean, or trees that had access to more water. And so this drought was a pretty big deal. We think it was unprecedented in the last 1,200 years. But we also think that we can expect a lot more of these types of droughts with climate change. So we thought it was an important study opportunity. So I live, and I'm talking to you today from just the other side of this mountain in this picture here. This is Goat Mountain in Bass Lake, California. And of course, so I was here when these trees were dying, and I, like to think of myself as this unbiased, neutral observer, but, because I'm trained as an ecologist, but it was really hard not to be like somewhat emotional about seeing all these trees die at once. It's like we have disturbances that happen rapidly in forests, like fire, but they don't happen at these spatial scales, although they are getting bigger. But the silver lining was that we thought it would be an opportunity to really evaluate some of our common management practices and see how areas where we did forest restoration fared, how they fared through the drought. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about our common management practices for those of you who aren't involved with forest management or forest ecology. In general, we try and open up the stands and remove the smaller trees, leave the larger trees. So in general, we have larger trees left. We also tend to favor pines in our management because with fire suppression, we have fewer pines proportionately than we would have. And we generally, I think you can say, tend to restore toward historical stand structure and composition. By historical, I mean prior to Euro-American settlement. And by stand structure, I mean just how trees are spatially arranged. in a stand, or how dense they are, or sort of what the average volume of the trees are. So just sort of the spatial metrics of trees. And I'll also say that our main forest treatments I'm going to talk to you today about are mechanical thinning. So where we go in there and thin out the trees with equipment, and prescribed burning. One of the reasons that we tend to still restore toward historical stand structure and composition, although we do know that, with the changing future, this might not always be the most strategic way to do things, is that these historical stand structures and compositions were what wildlife and other understory plants had evolved with. And then the other thing is that these systems were pretty resilient to fire and other disturbances. So the way things used to work is that, we get these low severity fires coming through these systems pretty frequently, sometimes every, 3 to 8 years. And, they'd come through and they'd finger out here and there and remove a lot of the small trees, but leave others. And the trees that tended to be left were larger and could easily withstand the fire. And now, of course, our forests are more like what you're seeing in the top photo here. And when fire comes through, there's a lot more fuel, and they tend to burn a higher proportion of the stand. They tend to burn hotter, and more trees die. So we actually have looked at this pretty extensively, and we know that in general, when we do fuel reduction treatments, these stands are better set up to withstand fire. But what we don't know is how these treatments set up these stands for drought. So with that, we designed this project. So I'm going to cover all these questions during this presentation, but I'm just going to start with focusing on the first two so I don't overwhelm you. But the first one is what died and where. So how did mortality patterns vary by management history and pre-drought stand structure? And so this is covered in a paper that we have out in ecological applications. And the second one is what about the individuals? How did drought and treatment influence individual ponderosa pine tree growth? And this is featured in a paper that we expect to be out soon. So in terms of our study design, we had a paired design. So we had treated and untreated areas that were pretty proximal in space. We collected data in 2016 and 2017. So in order for a place to be considered treated, they had to have had multiple areas or multiple treatments treated since the year 2000. And so those treatments could have been areas that were thinned and or burned. And then we also had untreated areas, and those had to be similar in terms of slope and aspect and successional stage, and those kinds of things. And all of our plots were in areas that were dominated by pines. We had 14 to 16 plots at each site. Oh, and I should say also that our study area ranged from the El Dorado to the Sierra National Forest. And it was sort of across this north to south gradient. And there was more, it's hard to tell on this map, but there was more precipitation in the north than in the south in general. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this was our plot design, so 12.6 meter radius. We measured things like tree species size and status, tree seedlings and saplings, fuel loading, shrub cover, and we took tree cores. So the first sort of thing that we had to look at was, did we even do what we wanted to do? Were we successful at our treatment? And that seems pretty basic, but it's always important to establish. So in general, our plots that we treated with mechanical thinning and burning had lower basal area, so sort of less overall volume, and stem density than areas that were not treated. They also had, on average, larger trees and a higher relative abundance of pines. So those are all things that we were trying to do. Our treatments worked. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the variables that we looked at other than treatment. So stand structure and climate. And I'm just going to talk about our results for ponderosa pine here, just because I think it would be tedious for me to go through these results for all the species. And I should also say that ponderosa pine died at the highest rates in our study. So across the study area, that rate was 40% of all ponderosa pines died. But when you look at certain sites where we had high mortality, like on the Sierra National Forest, the rates were much higher, I think as high as 80%. But in general, and this is sort of a no-brainer, for all the species, mortality increased as precipitation decreased. So I showed you that north-south gradient earlier. And as we move south within our study area, there was more mortality, and we think that was correlated to the lack of precipitation. And then I'm gonna talk about these graphs here that show sand structure and mortality probability. So it's mortality probability here on the y-axis. And on this first top graph, we're looking at trees per hectare greater than 30 centimeters. So that's just basically the density of large ponderosa pines. And the red here is dry sites, and the low here is the wetter sites, the sites with more precipitation. And so there's this interesting relationship on the dry sites where the probability of a ponderosa pine dying rose when there were more large ponderosa pines at the site. And so we interpret that to be that in areas where there were a lot of large ponderosa pines, the insects were attracted to those sites. We know they prefer large pines. And so therefore, when there were a lot of those, there were a lot of hosts around and more trees died. This next graph, I'm showing diameter at breast height. So that's basically just tree size. The larger the tree in general, the higher the mortality rates. And that is, I guess, similar to what I just told you when we were looking at this top graph. We know that the beetle prefer the larger trees, and this supports that. And then this last graph is showing basal area and mortality probability. And essentially, we're not really seeing a big difference at the wetter sites, but for some reason at the drier sites, we're seeing a slight decrease with more basal area. We're not quite sure why. Perhaps that's microsite buffering. And now I'm going to get into our treatment, what we think our treatment effects were. And I'm going to talk to you about all the major species that we looked at. So ponderosa pine, sugar pine, white fir, and cedar. I will say that we had black oak. Black oak was a common tree species throughout our plots, but we documented 0 black oaks dying through the course of our work. So for all these graphs, blue is untreated, and then the green are the treated areas. And again, we have mortality probability on the y-axis for all these graphs. And on the x-axis for all these graphs, we have precipitation. So with ponderosa pine, which died at 40% of all the ponderosa pine in our study, treatment was lower. The probability of mortality in treated areas was lower than in untreated areas. And as you can see, of course, there was also this change with precipitation. With sugar pine, which died at 35%, there was a marginal difference. Treatments made a marginal difference, but it wasn't as clear. And there's an interesting thing going on here with the white fir and the incense cedar, the 2 shade tolerant species, which died at 24% and 21% respectively, where in the drier sites here at this range, more trees actually died in the treated areas than in the untreated areas down here. And then when you got into the wetter sites in the white fir, less trees died in the treated areas than in the untreated areas. And so we're not quite sure what that's about, but we speculate that these shade tolerant trees maybe were under more water stress at the dry sites, and when we opened up the stand, you know, they were exposed to more sunlight and evaporative water stress. And next, I'm going to talk to you about that second question that I posed earlier, which had to do with individual growth in response to treatment. And I think this data is really cool. We're still working on this paper, but what we're looking at are results from the tree cores that we did, so the growth rings. And on the y-axis, we have annual growth. And then here we have baseline data. So we looked at the period between 1970 and 1999. So this was in a lot of cases before treatment would have happened. And here's pre-drought from the year 2000 to 2010. And here's when treatment would have been happening, but obviously before the drought. And here's the drought period that we looked at. And we have treated in greens and the untreateds in reds. And then the darker colors here are live, and the lighter shades are the dead trees. And as you can see for this baseline period, everything's just about the same, which makes sense. And then when we treated, there was this increase in growth in the treated ponderosa pine. So we only did this for ponderosa pine over the trees that and the untreated stands. And then I think this is where it gets really interesting. At this point, with the drought, then we really see a big change. And so these untreated stands definitely experience the greatest reduction in growth during the drought. And the treated stands, there's definitely less reduction. In fact, here in the treated trees that ended up surviving the drought, really there was almost no change over the course of the period that we looked. Whereas the trees that ended up dying in the treated stands, we did see a reduction of growth there, which I don't think is too surprising. So in summary, I'll just recap what I went over so far. Treatments worked. There are a few things that were the same across species. One was that mortality was driven by a lack of precipitation and some structure elements depending on the species, so density of conspecific trees and or basal area. And also there's a few things that were different among the species, and one of the important ones that was that mortality in both the pine species, so the ponderosa pine and the sugar pine, was influenced by the amount of big pines around in the drier areas. And so, like I said earlier, we think that that probably has to do with the fact that western and mountain pine beetles are known to attack the larger trees. And so the more potential hosts around, it might attract beetles to that particular stand. And then in terms of the forest treatments, there was definitely a difference with ponderosa pine. There was more survival among the ponderosa pine in areas where we treated. And remember, those died at the highest rates in our study. But individual growth rates, and well, I should say, and I think even more, more interestingly, the individual growth rates after treatment and growth was less reduced through drought and ponderosa pine than in the other species. In sugar pine, we found sort of a marginal effect of treatment, and in the incense cedar and white fir, treatment increased mortality in the dry areas, but decreased in the wet areas in the fir. And like I said earlier, we think that where we opened up that stand cover, and those shade tolerant trees had more exposure to sunlight, and they were already in harsh growing conditions. We think that treatment may have exacerbated that for them. So I'm gonna go into the next chapter of the talk here. So I'm gonna talk about forest recovery after drought. So I felt like this picture was appropriate for those of you that know these systems. We have a lot of oaks surviving. Like I said, we didn't document any that died in our study. And then we have these seedlings coming back, a couple dead trees in the background here. So for this part of the presentation, I'm gonna focus on the last two questions here. So what will our future forests look like given what happened? And we're sort of speculating that based on what's regenerating, so the seedlings and saplings. And how does that compare to the natural range of variation? So the natural range of variation is just a tool that we use, a range of conditions that characterizes basically historical stand structure, usually. Like I was talking about earlier, so those forests, or the range of conditions we think that the forest would have existed in prior to Euro-American settlement. And so for these results I'm going to talk about, we divided up all the results into 3 classes: low, moderate, and high mortality, just because we didn't want to wash out the results, because there was a pretty big difference in the types of mortality that we were seeing. So if you remember, in the northern part of the study, we didn't have nearly as much mortality as we did in the southern part of the study. So first I'm going to talk about what we think future forest structure is going to look like given tree, sapling, and seedling density. So this first graph I'm showing you is what it looked like prior to the drought. We have trees in dark green and saplings here in light green. And again, we have these 3 mortality classes: low, moderate, and high. We have density on the y-axis, and then whether the stand was treated or not on the x-axis. And then one more thing, we have the natural range of variation, that historical reference point down here in this gray band. And so I think this is interesting. It really shows, especially in the untreated areas, just how many trees that we have. And then it also shows that through treatment, we were able to get trees back within that range in general. And here's what it looks like after the drought. So still in these lower and moderate mortality classes, we have a lot more trees than we would have had historically. In the treated areas, it looks pretty similar to what it looked like pre-drought in the low and moderate mortality classes. But in the high mortality class right here, those numbers of trees in the darker green are dipping below that natural range of variation. And one more thing before we move on is just in terms of management, like we still have far too many trees in the low and moderate mortality classes. But with the saplings that we expect to come back in and become trees in these forests, we think that there's pretty good recovery potential even in the highest mortality areas. And then this graph here is showing seedlings. So the smallest trees that we have, density numbers here on the y-axis, and the treated status on the x-axis, and again, low, moderate, and high mortality classes. And pretty much across the board, there's more seedlings in the untreated plots than there are in the treated plots. And for some reason, we have especially low numbers of seedlings here in the highest mortality plots. So to recap, these areas are still probably too dense in terms of how they compare to historical stands, but we think we have good recovery potential here. Now I'm going to talk about tree size distribution, so just a distribution of sizes of trees. In general, we used to probably have more large trees and fewer small trees, and you can really see this in the untreated stands here at the top. And also here's some pictures just to give you a sense. So the top is an untreated stand. Here is the treated stand. So again, low, moderate, and high mortality. And then we have tree size across the x-axis for both of these. And this red here is the natural range of variation again. So rather than being in gray, this time it's in these red bars. And as you can see, we just have way more small trees in these areas than we would have had historically. And just to put that in perspective, see this blue line I put in here? That's the top of these graphs down here for our treated stands. So there's far fewer small trees, which was the goal of our treatments. And this, in the low mortality class, you can see that this really does follow sort of the nice distribution like we'd want it to. In the moderate mortality class, we're seeing sort of fewer trees, especially in this range, And then here in the high mortality class in the treated stands, we really are, lost our larger trees. And again, this is probably due to the fact that the beetles preferred the larger trees, but it's somewhat concerning. And so now I'm going to talk to you about species composition. I'll try and get through this quickly and clearly. It's a little bit more difficult to explain. So we looked at these three major species groups. So the pines, the shade tolerant, so those are the white fir and the cedar, and the hardwoods, which are the oaks. And here's untreated, here's treated. Prior to the drought, oh, and I'm only showing you data for the high mortality classes just because it's a little bit simpler than me trying to explain it for all of them. But prior to the drought, we had a lot of pines in the treated stands, and fewer in the untreated stands, more shade tolerance, which tend to do better with fire suppression. And then after the drought, we lost a lot of our pines. I showed you those numbers earlier. We lost 40% of the ponderosa and 35% of the sugar pines. So it's not surprising that we see this. And then there's proportionately more shade tolerance than we would have had before, and also more oaks. And this line here is showing you the saplings, so the teenager trees. And we have actually a somewhat nice balance here in the untreated plots, but very few pines in the treated plots for some reason, and a lot of oaks. And then for seedlings, for some reason we have very few pines in the untreated and a lot of shade tolerance. And in the treated plots, there's this nice balance here. And when you look at all stems, there really tends to be more of a nice balance, or a better balance in the treated than in the untreated, where we just have more shade tolerance. So just to recap, before the drought, we had relatively more pines and less shade tolerance in treated plots. And after the drought, we have, in general, more shade tolerant trees and hardwoods. So this is the last data slide I'm going to present to you. I'm showing you the fuel load part of our study. I always save this for last because I always thought that this was the important management issue when I have given this presentation in the past. So the top graph is showing just the dead and downed woody fuel loads. And of course, when we collected the data, most of the trees were still standing in our study area, although now I think at least 50% of them have fallen in general. And so these are the fuel loadings, and we did pretty good with our treatments. We got the fuel loadings down, as you can see. The gray is the natural range of variation again. Blue here is untreated and green is treated. But like I said, during our study, most of the dead trees were still standing. And this is sort of the snag basal area. And this graph was really concerning to me. So we're looking at snag basal area in the low, moderate, and high mortality classes. And this gray, again, is a natural range of variation. And you can see across the board, we have way more dead trees than we would have ever had historically in terms of basal area in both treated and untreated plots. And so at that point in the presentation, when I gave it in the past, I always say, I talk about the paper that Scott Stevens and colleagues did. I think it came out in 2018, where they warned that with the drought mortality, we could experience these mega fires. You know, and the fuel loadings were going to be so vast over such a broad area and so heavy. You know, we could really expect to lose a lot of our forests as we knew them. And of course, in 2020, we got a taste of that with a couple really big fires within our area. So the 2020 Creek Fire on the Sierra National Forest burned up some of our plots, and I think it's 380,000 acres now. It's just about out, but largest single fire event in California history. And then on the Sequoia National Forest, which also experienced a lot of mortality, we had another big fire down there. This is an image from one of the sequoia groves. And those are giant sequoias that you're looking at. So just these very extreme high severity fires that we experienced. And of course, you can't rule out fuel loading as one of the major drivers, even though weather was also a very important factor. But in general, so our future forests are going to be less densely populated, and the trees are in general going to be smaller than before the drought. But trees are still going to be too dense in areas that were untreated in all but the highest mortality areas. We're also going to see more hardwood dominance, which may confer some drought resistance. So we think that's a good thing. And remember, of course, very few oaks within this, or we documented no oaks dying within the study. So we think that they're very resistant to drought, at least the kind that we just experienced. And while we have lost a lot of forest to high severity fire, we still have a lot of forest left, and the very high fuel loading that we have in those unburned areas should be a priority for our management. And then in terms of other management messages, in general with our treatments, it was nice to look back and realize that we did what we wanted to do with those treatments. And that even after the drought, there were some benefits that persisted in terms of species composition, removal of small trees, and reducing the downed fuel. But we still need to be thinking about removing some of the small trees. We didn't really think reforestation was that urgent. We did see a lot of regeneration, although I think one could make a great case for planting pines in high mortality areas. But we really might need to be thinking about reforestation after some of these big wildfires with all the high severity that we've had. There's not a lot of surviving trees to be seeding into these fires naturally. And again, we think reducing fuel should be a priority. I wanted to talk a little bit about managing for diversity. We tend to always favor fire adapted pines in our management, but given how poorly they fared in the drought, we think it might be prudent to think about managing for a more diverse mix, including cedar, which did pretty well, giant sequoia, which of course mostly tend to grow in groves, but they do quite well when we plant them, and oaks. And also, we're already seeing transitions from pines to oaks at the lower elevations within our forests, and that this was definitely sped up during the drought. And so we're not sure we recommend a lot of investment in planting pines at those lower elevations. And then in terms of restoring natural fire regimes, this is always important. Again, we had these low severity fires that preferentially killed smaller trees, and they created heterogeneity. I really love this image here. This is from one of John Muir's books. It shows the pine forests as he would have encountered them. And you can see there's a lot of openings and patchiness. And in general, the more heterogeneity in these forests, the more resilient they are to fire and other disturbances, we think. So the homogeneous forests that we have now are more vulnerable to severe and sort of wide sweeping disturbance. And we think that in general, the stocking rates in those forests can't be supported given the water availability that we have, especially during droughts. So to prevent synchronous disturbance in homogeneous forests, we really recommend thinking about things like prescribed burning at large scales, manage wildfire. So this might be the most effective tool that we have, especially where fires can burn away from urban interface and at times of the year where they're burning in a lower severity manner. This is a really good way to get a large area, quote unquote, treated. And then our thinning treatments. So that is all I had. Thank you very much. I have my email address in case any of you have any questions you'd like to email me later on. I think now is the point where we can move to questions. Is that right, Alexis?
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really interesting presentation. And yeah, if people have questions, you can either unmute yourself or you can put it in the chat and we can read it out. All right, Max Odland asked, can you talk about how natural range of variation was determined, in particular for the snag basal area?
Well, that's a great question, and I can actually send you our reference document that we have if you want to send along your email address. I don't quite know about the snag basal area, but in general, it's a lot of hard work to get that natural range of variation information. The people that have written those scour historical documents, they look at old pictures. There's old data that were taken in some of the early forest surveys. They use the General Land Office data. So the surveyors would survey, they would take some forest metrics at all the like quarter and section boundaries across the landscape. So they try and pull the data from a lot of different sources. And there's a really good one on pines and mixed conifer systems that I can send, and I think that would outline where the snag basal area information comes from.
I have a question. Thanks for sharing your research. It was a great talk. I was curious about heterogeneity within treatments. Just anecdotally speaking, I feel like for simplicity's sake, I see a lot of, this diameter and under should be gone. And I feel like when I go back to the stand, it looks really homogeneous, and I wonder about how that would translate into, pests like bark beetles easily transferring from tree to tree and fire damage. So I guess if you have thoughts about treatment, how to like frame treatments to be more heterogeneous. Oh my gosh.
I know, it's always a hard one for me.
I don't know. Would you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. So like how to create more heterogeneity in those stands, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, and like how to structure a treatment so that that's the final product instead of this like, I think the easiest thing for everyone involved is like, 12-inch diameter and under goes. But if like really what's only going on there is a small amount of variation above the 12-inch in diameter, I feel like it just produces too homogeneous of a stand. So, but it's like, I feel like I don't know how to structure the treatment from the get-go so that it's more variability.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I know that's something that a lot of people have struggled with on the forests that I work with. They don't tend to let me design prescriptions, but I know that there's some good work done. I'm sure you're probably familiar with the work by Malcolm North and the GTR 220. And if not, I can send that to you, but I think he has some guidelines in there. And I know too that on the Sierra National Forest where I work, in the Dinky Collaborative Landscape, they worked with that, especially I think within fisher habitat. And so I think it was kind of this, it took a while at first to get the marking crews up to speed, but they pretty carefully designed some prescriptions and worked with the marking crews and monitored to see what they had done to sort of show them how to bring in patchiness. But yeah, I don't think it's always easy. I feel like the easy thing is to do, you're right, is to just take out the smaller diameter trees. And we actually really wanted to document the spatial arrangement within the stands in this study. And we actually had people in the crews GPS each tree, but the data is so messy and we're not sure about the error with the GPS unit. So we haven't really used the data.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we've got a couple more questions in the chat from Marilyn Jasper. For prescribed or other managed fires, are permits needed, like NEPA or CEQA, and are pre and or follow-up studies conducted on the wildlife impacts of those burns?
Oh, great question. So for managed wildfire, my understanding is no, it's just a natural wildfire that happens. It's going to happen without a permit usually. For prescribed fire, we do need to go through some sort of NEPA process on federal lands. And, you know, one thing that seems to be happening lately is this move toward more programmatic NEPA is what we're calling it. So I know this year National Forest is working on that for the forest. So it's just sort of this broader document that covers the whole forest with NEPA when it comes to something like prescribed burning. So, and again, this isn't totally complete, nor is it signed off on, but I know it's the direction that they'd like to go, where managers can identify stands that are, for instance, in need of prescribed burning and therefore implement prescribed burning there with the guidance of wildlife specialists and other specialists, and accomplish that burning without doing separate NEPA for each one. And then in terms of your question about wildfire monitoring or wildlife monitoring, I'm not very sure, actually. I know that there is a lot of wildlife monitoring that's done. I'm not sure if it's specifically done for the prescribed burns that we do. I'd have to look into that for you. I'm not a wildlife biologist, so that's sort of beyond me.
And we have another question from Varia. Is it possible that more pines died because there were more pine specialized beetles than beetles specialized for other tree species?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. The bark beetle populations definitely explode. The western pine and mountain pine bark beetle populations definitely exploded. So that could definitely be a reason why, for sure. And I'm not sure how we disentangle that. But, and like I said during the presentation, the work by Chris Fettig and Leif Mortensen and their colleagues is really good at describing sort of what happened in terms of the insects.
And Max Odlin has shared in the chat, there's a new paper on the variability in stand structure in Sierra forests with active fire regimes, and he's shared a link as well.
Oh, neat.
All right, if we don't have any other questions, I think we can probably wrap up. Thank you so much, Amarina. This was a great talk, and I can email all of the attendees out a recording of this webinar promptly as well.
All right, well, thank you for the opportunity to talk. If any of you want additional resources from me that I mentioned, please feel free to write me at my email address shown on the screen.
All right, thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your Wednesday.